Hello, Rally for the Republic listeners. This is Bryan Rudnick coming to you from my headquarters today with a special guest, Alan Gottlieb of the Second Amendment Foundation. I've had the pleasure of knowing Alan for many years. He is a true mover and shaker in the conservative movement who has spent decades trying to save our country, which is why I wanted him on the show today. And I'm going to be back to you with more right after the break.
This is a battle cry for the American way of life and a relentless pursuit of truth and justice. It comes from a voice with unmatched experience and unyielding resolve. Join us as we dissect current events and tip the scales in your favor. This is Rally for the Republic with your host, Bryan Rudnick.
Alan, welcome to Rally for the Republic.
Bryan, it's great to be with you and your listeners and viewers. Thank you.
But we've got an exciting show with you, so let's get right into it. Will you please tell the Rally for the Republic listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in politics and what you've been doing?
Well, I guess what got me involved in politics was when I was in college, an organization known as Young Americans for Freedom. And I became chapter chairman of the University of Tennessee and state chairman in the state of Tennessee. Then I got elected to the national board and then went on to a staff position. And that's what really got me involved in politics to start with. I got involved with the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, founded the Second Amendment Foundation. And I was probably the youngest person ever elected to the American Conservative Union Board of Directors, CPAC, which I'm still currently a director. I'm now their senior statesman, I guess.
So what caused you to start the Second Amendment Foundation?
Well, I was already working with the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, which was a grassroots and direct lobbying organization. But back then in 1974, there was no 501c3 educational legal defense, tax-exempt foundation for gun rights. And so I founded the Second Amendment Foundation because there was a need there, particularly in trying to eventually create a platform or foundation to ever get a case to the United States Supreme Court validating the Second Amendment as an individual right.
Okay. So what does the Second Amendment Foundation do, if you don't mind getting into a little more details?
Well, what most know for now is our legal action. And on the legal front, we've had over 260 cases we've been involved in, not counting amicus briefs that we file. Currently, right now, we have 56 active cases in federal court across the country. And I think it's 8 or 9 amicus briefs in cases that are also active, going on all at the same time. In fact, October 8th, we have oral arguments at the Supreme Court in one of our cases known as Vanderstock, which deals with the Biden administration trying to define frames or receivers as full firearms and basically put it in a category that you could make your own gun in your own home. And we also are known very much for our National Gun Rights Policy Conference, which brings gun rights leaders from all national and state and local groups together every year to plot out the next year's agenda for the gun rights movement, so to speak. And likewise, we do training conferences state by state for gun rights activists to get them more trained how to deal with the media, how to raise funds, how to grow a grassroots movement. And we also do a lot of publications and research when it comes to gun rights and the Second Amendment.
So I imagine the Biden years, you've not been lacking in work.
No, the Biden years have given us an awful lot of work. Of course, what's really given us much of our work, especially on the legal front, was the so-called Bruen decision by the U.S. Supreme Court a couple of years ago now, which opened up the floodgates for a lot of litigation. That and the McDonald versus Chicago case, that was the Second Amendment Foundation case that we won at the U.S. Supreme Court, which incorporated the Second Amendment through the 14th Amendment, making it applicable to all the states. That and the Bruen decision, expanding the definition of the Second Amendment, surely has created a lot of work for us.
And now that Kamala Harris wants to expand on the Biden agenda, the anti-gun Biden agenda, it looks like they're rallying behind this new executive order that they promoted last week. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, no doubt that, Biden has been an extremely anti-gun rights president. But in all honesty, Kamala Harris is significantly much further in that direction. She's definitely a gun confiscator. She's talked about she supports compensated confiscation, whereby the government would pay you something and take your guns and you wouldn't have them. Biden has been for gun prohibition, so to speak, and blocking sales of firearms so you couldn't get any new ones, but he hasn't really talked about taking away the guns you currently own. Kamala Harris, that's another story. She's all for that. the executive orders that Biden and Harris just put in place are kind of tame compared to what their real agenda is. So they're trying to throw some red meat to the gun confiscation lobby, but at the same time not scare the general public. Harris is talking about how I'm a gun owner. Walz talks about how he's a gun owner, but it's good for them, but not for us. The hypocrisy is just absolutely amazing when it comes to gun rights and Harris, Biden, and Walz for that matter.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the news out of Israel yesterday about that Tel Aviv terrorist shooting.
I did.
You saw how they there was a off-duty reserve soldier who carried his sidearm with him that took out one of the terrorists.
Yeah, Israel has increased lots of people having permits to have firearms over the past year since October 7th of last year. And it's paid off. This isn't the only time where somebody has stopped a terrorist attack in Israel because they were able to have a firearm to do so.
And I remember, here in the United States, obviously you and I know that happens a lot more than the media wants to let us believe. And
yeah, Bryan, it really bothers me how the media buries those stories. Being biased is one thing, but you don't even cover the news stories at all. It's worse than even being biased in their reporting. But crossing my desk every day, I get several reports of people around the country using firearms to protect themselves and their family from criminal attacks, and particularly with a lot of the violent people that are crossing our border illegally, coming into the United States, committing various heinous crimes. I've been getting more and more reports all the time.
As somebody who is active, and I talk about it once in a while here on Rally for the Republic, I'm very active, a gun enthusiast and 2A advocate. And I go to the gun range quite regularly and mostly do tactical training. And after that Indiana mall shooting occurred, what was it, about 18 or 24 months ago, and the young man stopped that mall shooter at about 40 yards. Everybody I know wanted to train to be like that kid, and the media kept going after the sheriff, wanting to have him arrested.
Yeah, the media is biased on a lot of issues, but when it comes to firearms ownership, it's just unbelievable. It's off the charts.
Right. I mean, thank God that sheriff viewed that kid as a hero, like the rest of us.
Yes.
All right. But, going back to the executive order from last week, you mentioned obviously their intent is to expand their gun grabbing agenda and obviously appease their base. But, they obviously want us to believe it's going to end school shootings and create more funding somehow for active shooter training at schools. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that executive order, in all honesty, was more symbolism over substance. There's nothing in that order that is going to make us safer, period. But it's something that's throughout there saying, hey, we're trying to do something. I think what that executive order might really show is the failure of the White House's, office to end gun violence that they have in the White House itself, because it's been totally ineffective and hasn't solved any problems whatsoever.
So you don't think Kamala Harris, as the director of the anti-gun violence strike force, has succeeded like she has at the border?
Yeah, it's about the same, the failure both at the border and with stopping so-called gun violence. I don't like the term gun violence because guns don't have a brain to hate with or a finger to pull their own trigger. I mean, it's really human violence, using a gun as the tool to do it with. And so I think when you focus on gun violence, you're not really talking about violence or stopping, criminals to start with, or violent people out on the streets, most of which, by the way, have mental health issues. And this administration hasn't done very much just to help solve our mental health problems in our country, which is the root of a lot of this.
Yeah, it's great that you bring that up because that dovetails right into my next topic here. It was last night's debate. As I'm sure you heard, the very few moments that the moderators gave to discussing the Second Amendment and related topics. But J.D. Vance did a great job of bringing up mental health as the concern. And
yeah, he did.
And, Tim Walz, I guess, favors a lot of parental responsibility laws, and he's okay leaving his shotgun in the car when he was pheasant.
Yeah, I noticed that. It doesn't leave a gun in a safe position where somebody can't get their hands on it and have some mayhem happen. He's a very irresponsible gun owner, in my opinion, to start with. And quite honestly, their solutions just don't work, and they've been proven over time not to work. it's really sad. I mean, they really attack the gun rather than the individuals who create the crimes. And that's the only way you're going to solve the problem. If you attack gun ownership with all your funding and all your efforts, which maybe is less than 1% of the problem, the 99% of the problem, the people who misuse firearms, and you don't hold them accountable, particularly in Democratic-controlled cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. That's where most of the crime happens. If you take out the crime in all those big cities, America is a very safe place.
Yeah, it's funny, you mentioned that, and I want to dive into a few other things you've just said, because here at Rally for the Republic, one of the things I pride myself on is helping our listeners to gain information and insight that they can personally take to their friends and family members, and they do the job of persuading and influencing the uninformed Americans. So if you could, I'm going to break down some of the things you talked about, right? We know mental health is a problem. So I've advocated, and I'd love to get your insights, that we should stop sending funds over to the Ukraine, hire more police officers and law enforcement officers to guard our schools, to keep our kids safe.
Well, I don't want to get into sending funding over to the Ukraine. My problem with the Ukraine, quite honestly, is that I don't mind so much funding them. What I really mind is no accountability to the funding, where the money goes. That's my real concern. And as far as defunding the police, I mean, that's really stupid. And Biden, Harris have, been, and Walz in particular, have all been in, forefront of defunding our police, which makes us all less safe. It also, which is funny, it's counterproductive to their anti-gun activities, because when you defund the police and you have less police officers per capita, people won't care about their safety, so they go out and buy more firearms. So in some ways, Biden, Harris, and Walz have been the best gun salesmen in our history, and they don't even realize it. And that I guess, lack of intelligence.
Yeah, I remember seeing how much the price of ammo has skyrocketed since Obama took office.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like, I always say, I like to, when I talk to anti-gun audiences or the general public, I always like to start off asking them a question: what has 4 legs and chases cats? And of course, the first answer I always get is a dog, and I say, no, I'm sorry. But it's Mrs. Katz and her attorney. And the point I'm trying to make is some things aren't always the way they appear to be. And that's definitely the case in the whole gun control debate.
Yeah. So could you help the audience understand more? Like, what are some of the solutions that you and your organization advocate for? You mentioned.
Yeah, well, first of all, things like defunding the police and cashless bail, and putting, like in Chicago, where if you get arrested for a gun crime, they virtually put you back out on the street the same day, is totally absurd. We see in Chicago, they put a gun criminal back out on the street. The next day, he gets another gun and creates another crime, which they like to call gun violence. And those things just don't work. But what I like, one of the things I always raised, is that if you take a look at who commits the crimes in our country, most of them have criminal records to start with. And in most cases, they're felons who are out on parole or probation, and in which case you don't have all of your rights restored to you. One of those rights at that point, if you're a violent felon, is that you don't have a right to have a gun. But nobody ever goes and checks up, because there's this lack of money and resources. Nobody goes to check up to see if there's a gun in their house, or making sure they don't have access to a firearm. So they're left out there all by themselves to create more crimes. And again, if you put those resources to the 1% of the people who commit all the crimes, rather than putting all those resources to the 99% that don't commit the crimes, you might solve a problem.
And where do you stand on the issue of parental responsibility laws related to?
Well, I really agree very much with what J.D. Vance said in his debate. It's basically, it depends on the case. Each case has different facts to it. And there's no doubt there are cases where there are some parents that are irresponsible and should be prosecuted. And there are some cases where parents aren't irresponsible and should be prosecuted. J.D. Vance gave the example that if, one of your children in your house steals the gun, you shouldn't be held responsible for it, because you tried to protect the gun to begin with, and you didn't give him permission or buy it for him or her, and you shouldn't hold the parent responsible. But if a parent knows that one of their children has emotional issues or psychological problems, and they give them a gun, well, then maybe they should be held responsible. So I think J.D. Vance hit the nail on the head.
So you also mentioned, the Tim Walz example of storing guns in the car. And I know here in Florida, they even floated some ideas about implementing laws at the legislature that would force gun owners to have lock devices and things of that nature or be held liable if a gun is stolen out of a car.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of mandating that you have to have your gun locked up, especially if you need it for self-defense. It doesn't do you any good. And that's what most people use a firearm for. But just leaving a gun loose in a car unlocked isn't very prudent. And obviously, if that gun is misused, you have some responsibility, some culpability there. So I saw Florida's law, and I think it, quite frankly, just went way too far and didn't make any sense. But if you wrote one that made sense, it's a whole nother story. But realistically, you don't really need a new law in those kind of cases, because reckless endangerment is already on the books. And if you leave a gun someplace where somebody is recklessly endangered, they can be prosecuted under the current laws that we already have in all 50 states.
Thank you. I think that was a really important point that hopefully listeners will take back to their uninformed friends and family members. And, I guess it's fair to say that you don't think the 2A community can sleep better knowing Kamala Harris is a gun owner?
No,
because Tim Walz was really proud of that last night.
I know. It's also hysterical. She talked about how if somebody came into her house, she'd shoot them. And then she started to giggle and laugh. Well, shooting somebody is not a laughing matter to start with. But more importantly, she isn't shooting anybody because she has Secret Service protection. You and I don't.
It's good that you bring that point up, because as we all know, as responsible gun owners, shooting somebody is like the last thing we ever want to be doing. And we're always taught about being careful and identifying a true threat.
Correct. And she was just doing that again. She's trying to position herself as not looking so extreme and so radical, because she's seen polling data, just like we have, that shows in the battleground states, places like, Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, as Arizona, Nevada, gun ownership is very high. And she knows she's already alienated a lot of gun owners. She's trying to win them back and trick them so that she can win this election. That's what it's all about. It's all about politics. It's not really about policy. Just like she said, her values haven't changed. She's always been anti-gun rights, and she still is.
You are listening to Rally for the Republic with your host, Bryan Rudnick.
Yeah, I've seen that video of her, I think it's San Francisco, saying we're going to go into people's homes and get those guns.
Yeah, that was amazing, because that's not just a Second Amendment violation. That's a Fourth Amendment violation without new due process, without, a court warrant, to just go into people's houses, to see how they're storing their firearms. That's an invasion of privacy. It's totally unconstitutional on multiple grounds. The fact that she was not an attorney, but a prosecutor and an attorney general in California, to make statements like that is scary. It's really dangerous.
So on the point of being scared about a, Harris-Walz administration, we know that Tim Walz is probably going to come after the guns he carried in war, if you have them in your home. What other things should scare us?
Well, let me say, first of all, he didn't carry any guns in war because he wasn't in war. That was, again, one of his lies or false statements. And he does this an awful lot. But quite frankly, we know that they're going to go after those.
Well, he's a knucklehead sometimes. He said that himself.
Yeah, okay. I can find something I can agree with Walz on. He's a knucklehead.
So are there other specific policy items that concern you that they might seek to enact if they were to unfortunately get elected, or if they steal the election?
Yeah, some of the things that we have been working on, particularly in the courts, is enfranchising Second Amendment rights to young adults, 18 to 21-year-olds, which right now under federal law cannot legally buy a gun. We've got a number of court cases dealing with that. We've got one in Pennsylvania with getting 18 to 20-year-olds permits to carry a firearm. That's currently now waiting for a cert petition at the U.S. Supreme Court, and is actually scheduled for October 10th to go to a conference with the Supreme Court. And we're looking at the so-called sensitive places where they know, okay, we now have to let some people carry firearms for self-protection. We'll just make sure there's no place where they can carry them. And we've got a number of lawsuits in that area as well. There's lots of things this administration is doing in a lot of different areas to try to undercut Second Amendment rights, and we're in court constantly battling them. The Vanderstock case I mentioned earlier, which is going to have oral arguments on the 8th of October, that case is over the executive order making any frames or receivers or partial parts of firearms defined as a full firearm, so that people in their own homes can't make their own firearms, because at one, they're attacking the firearms industry, trying to put them out of business any way they can. And then if they can put the firearms industry out of business, the only way you can have a gun is to make it yourself. And they're trying to make sure that they get ahead of the curve on that and prohibit you from doing so.
So on the topic of sensitive places that you mentioned, I've always found I understand the need to safeguard schools as an example, but you've got parents dropping kids off at schools in the morning that have to go somewhere where they would prefer to have a gun on their body during the day, and they're legally entitled to carry that gun all day except for when they drop off and pick up their child from a school.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I agree with you totally. And that's why some of these laws are ridiculous and not workable. But more importantly, just because you put a sign up, a gun-free school zone, a criminal, that is him as an invitation because he knows he has a target-rich environment. Nobody can shoot back. I mean, the answer to this, I think, is more resource officers that are armed.
Well, that's what I meant actually on the question about Ukraine, by the way. Is I'd like to see more of that money going to school resource officers and to protect our children instead of Ukrainian children.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of things that this country needs to do. And the Biden-Harris, administration surely hasn't done it. And the Harris-Walz administration surely won't do it.
Yeah. I mean, as we saw in Georgia at that unfortunate shooting a few weeks ago, thank God they had a properly trained school resource officer to deal with the
Yes. Yes, otherwise there'd be a lot more innocent children and teachers would not be alive today. See, the other side never wants to talk about. They talk about when somebody becomes a victim of a gun crime, but they never want to talk about when somebody is alive today because they had a gun to protect themselves or others. And the numbers are astounding. I mean, the minimum values I see in any of the surveys, polls, or studies that have done are 800,000 people a year use a firearm to defend themselves, their family, or property from a criminal attack. Yet you never hear about that at all.
Repeat that again, please, so everybody really hears you loud and clear.
Sure. On the most minimum studies done, 800,000 people a year use a firearm to protect themselves, their family, or property from criminal attack. And in the mainstream media or the legacy media, you never hear that because it undercuts their theme of guns are evil, guns are violent, nobody should own a gun. They don't want to talk about that because it derails their agenda.
Yeah. So talking about derailing the agenda of the left and the legacy media, I asked my staff to come up with some questions to throw your way. And one of the things they thought would be great to hear you talk about is how so many people are listening to the left and the media say that there are these gun show loopholes and people are buying, they're intimating that law-abiding citizens are buying guns without proper background checks. And that's why we need universal background checks in this country.
Yeah, well, let me first of all say on the gun shows, and their so-called gun show loophole, most states have laws that anybody at the gun show selling a gun has to be background checked, has to go through a licensed dealer.
And that's the way it's been when I bought at a gun show.
Right. Well, under federal law, any licensed dealer in the country has to put somebody under a background check before they sell them a firearm to start with. What the so-called universal background check they're trying to put in there is basically a universal registration system, so they know who owns the guns and where they are. And registration leads to confiscation. And that's exactly what, Kamala Harris and Walz, where they want to go. And so that's why we really oppose that. Additionally, it's a waste of time, effort, and money on the so-called universal background check, the way they define it. Now, if my neighbor, who I know very well, needs to borrow my gun to protect herself, as an example, because there was a former spouse or boyfriend threatening her, why do we need to go through a background check? And to do so, we have to go through a background check, pay a fee to a licensed dealer for me to let her have the gun in my state of Washington, as an example. And then when she wants to give the gun back to me, we have to go through a background check again on me to get my own gun back. I mean, that doesn't solve any crime problems whatsoever. And in many of the states now, I mean, for me to transfer my gun to my son or a family member, an immediate family member, I have to go through a background check. So when they talk about their universal background checks, what they're trying to do is put, roadblocks in the way of legitimate firearms ownership, making it more difficult so that people won't bother to own a firearm.
I appreciate you, bringing that up, because I've often said I don't know anywhere where you can legally buy a gun without a background check.
Well, there are some states, Brian, in all honesty, that you can sell a gun to somebody, without a background check, from one person to another, gun out of your collection to another individual, as an example. But those aren't the guns that are ever used in crime. The data doesn't show that. So it doesn't really do anything. Again, people spend all the time and money.
So we're clear, just to go back to what you said, I want everybody to hear it. I want to make sure it really stands out. So those gun violent issues we hear about in Chicago, where gun violence and street gang crimes have increased. It's not one neighbor selling his gun to the next neighbor in the suburbs that's causing that, right?
No, it's mostly involved with gang members and drug dealers. Is what you're looking at. People are already prohibited from having a gun and shouldn't have one, but are out on the street in most cases with multiple convictions already, and the city puts them back out on the street, and they're there to do another crime. It makes us all less safe, and all the more reason why people in Chicago are now buying guns in record numbers to protect themselves.
But not from a gun store in the city of Chicago, right?
Suburbs around Chicago, that's usually where they're buying them. There's a number of gun stores, right around Chicago. But in Illinois, in this whole state, you have to have what's known as a firearms owner's ID card ahead of time before you're even allowed to go buy a firearm or continue to own one in your own home. So Illinois is a highly regulated state for firearms ownership. These laws don't work. Criminals are called criminals because they break laws.
Yeah, when I lived in Massachusetts, I remember what a big deal it was when I got my Class A for all lawful purposes without restrictions. And people thought that was such a big deal. They wanted to break open a bottle of champagne.
Yeah, Massachusetts is still a very tough state for gun owners. And it's the states that have the toughest gun laws also usually have the highest gun crime problems.
And does your organization take a position on open carry versus concealed carry?
Well, our legal position in our court cases are that the government has to allow you one or the other. They can't ban both because then you have no right to carry to protect yourself, and that's unconstitutional. Time, place, and manner restrictions have always been considered to be illegal in lots of areas of constitutional law, but you can't say there's no place at all or no way to do it. So our situation with that is that as long as a state or a city is going to allow you one or the other, it's constitutional and they're off the hook legally. On the other hand, what I urge people to do is to carry concealed, not open, because the element of surprise is an important self-defense feature. Don't let the criminal know you're carrying the gun. If you can see it, you might be the first victim in a place, a bank, the example he walks into, sees you have the gun, and you get shot first. If you have the gun concealed, you got the advantage over the criminal. So I'd urge people to carry concealed because I think it makes more sense. But I think you should have the right to do both.
So with the few minutes we have left here in today's episode, let me ask you, what do you believe is the most important thing gun owners and folks who are focused on the Second Amendment need to do at this tail end of the election?
If you're not registered to vote, get registered to vote. There's too many gun owners that are not registered to vote, and it really disturbs me a whole lot. And if you are registered, make sure you vote as early as you can, so that vote gets counted and it's in the box, so to speak. Right now, our rights really depend on it. This probably is the most critical election coming up involving gun rights in our history, and it's pretty wide difference between Trump, where he stands on supporting gun rights, and where Harris stands on opposing your right to have the means of self-defense.
What advice do you give to young people in particular about trying to get involved in politics today?
Well, I got involved at a very young age, and I think it paid out a whole lot because I'm a lot more knowledgeable and more active, engaged in the political process. Your rights are always on the line. Your freedom, your wallet. And as a result, I think it's really important to make sure that you're engaged and you protect your future. The younger you are, the longer future you have, and the more things can go wrong, messing up your life. Government, the slogan for them is "I'm here to help you," and usually they're not here to help you. Government's usually here to make life more difficult for you. If you care about individual freedom and individual rights, and care about being able to control your own life, you should be engaged in the political system.
And what do you believe is the biggest threat to our republic today?
Our biggest threat to our republic today is probably the fact that we're not on solid economic grounds right now, with high deficits and debt in this country. And that involves our national security, because if you don't have money, you can't afford to pay to protect your nation. And I think that undermines our ability to function positive for the American people. And that's why I think President Trump's, Make America Great Again, America First agenda is really important right now.
Awesome. And what can the Rally for the Republic listeners do to help you continue to succeed at the second?
Well, if they go to our website at saf.org, or just put Second Amendment Foundation in your browser and we'll pop up. First of all, get educated, come to our website and see everything we're doing, both in the courts and in the legislative agenda system. And then at the same time, if you can join or donate, I'd be much appreciated because it keeps us active, alive, and funded. We get funded mostly by people making $15 and $25 donations. Our opponents get funded by the Michael Bloombergs and the George Soroses of the world, writing $1 million checks. So while we're really grassroots based, the other side is really the class of billionaires who already have private security to protect them, so they don't really care. They're funded by them, and so we need your support as much as possible.
Rally for the Republic listeners, this has been an interview with Alan Gottlieb, the founder of the Second Amendment Foundation, who I forgot to mention at the beginning of the show is the author of, over a dozen books you've written, Alan?
I think it's 24 books now.
24 books.
Or co-written with.
And we're honored to have you on because you've been in just about every media outlet imaginable. So,
yes.
And I know from personal experience that you have made a huge and significant impact in our nation's politics for many decades. So I thank you for your service and being willing to spend your time with us today.
Thank you for your kind words, Brian. I really appreciate them very much. And you've been a great activist a lot of years on your own and have great accomplishments, and I appreciate those as well.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you again for joining us here at Rally for the Republic. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for joining us on Rally for the Republic, where we are fighting for America's future. Visit 1776coalition.com. Rally for the Republic podcast is available on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and download. Join Bryan Rudnick next time as we continue to fight for the American way of life and challenge the hypocrisy. This is Rally for the Republic.